Hey everyone, how's it going? This is the Bald Metal Nerd coming at you with another wonderful video. In this one, I am going to give the 2020 State of Metal address because I think this is going to be a hell of a lot more fun and hopefully way more interesting than the State of the Union address. I don't know that's tomorrow. I'm recording this on February 3rd, but it's going up. I don't know what day this is scheduled to go up, but whatever. Anyway, I hope you guys like this. Basically, I'm going to be talking about the state of metal as of right now, or as close to right now as I can get with the information I was able to find on the internet, from the perspective of what I would call, a second generation metalhead, right? And what I mean by that, people who I would consider second generation metalheads were pretty old. The absolute oldest of us are probably in late 40s, early 50s. That's pushing the upper edge. And the lower edge of that are people who are in their, man, I can't even think. The youngest would be like in their late 30s, right? And I'm 41, going to be 42 this year, so I'm I'm definitely not young, but I guess on the younger side of that. Basically, these are folks that kind of grew up with metal in the 80s and 90s, right? So that's who I'm speaking to right now. Us middle-aged guys who are metal fanatics. So today I am an old man in a Judas Priest shirt, for whatever that's worth. So first thing I'm going to talk about is basically how I see the metal scene currently, right? Basically, the way I see the metal scene currently is there's lots of the old guard still out there kicking ass. And by the old guard, I mean bands that started in the 80s, right? We've got just some examples: Overkill, Creator, Testament, Death Angel, Exodus, etc., etc., etc. I could go on and on. These bands are still vital and producing excellent music even now, right? So I really can't wait for the New Testament album. That's gonna heard the first few songs off that, as I'm sure all of you have, and they are awesome, and I'm really looking forward to that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So yes, there's lots of old guard out there that still is vital ever doing great music. Now, there is innovation in the sound, like newer bands. I think what they're bringing to the table is a lot of progressive elements seem to be creeping in, and just basically they're experimenting with more different sounds, right? But the cool thing about that is those elements are coming in, and a lot of the old guard are basically taking that in as well and throwing that into their music. So there's definitely what I would call a marrying of the older and newer styles, like just mixing together, because of course all of the newer bands are just more or less in one way or another aping what came before. So yes, they're aping what came before and creating something new, and then the older bands are like, oh hey, I like what these newer bands are doing, and integrating some of that stuff. So it's kind of just a total intermingling, as it were, of older and newer elements together, which I think that's there, video over. No, there's a little more to it than that. But I just wanted to kind of talk about what I thought the overall scene was doing. So we're going to look at a few articles, and I will link all of these in the description below if you guys want to check these out for yourself and see what you think of it. So the first article we're going to look at is... this one is called 11 Modern Metal Bands That Are Destined for Classic Rock Greatness. So we're going to just scroll through this real quick. When the hell is this dated? 2013. Not exactly recent. But hey, it's at least from this century, right? Even though it's 7 years... nearly 7 years old now. So, event, they're going in alphabetical order, which is fine. All right, Avenged Sevenfold, fair enough. Love them or hate them, they are definitely, what's the word I'm looking for? A big band that has a lot of followers. As far as my thoughts on them, I think they're okay. I like some of their stuff somewhat. They're definitely not one of my favorite bands, but I can take them or leave them. Baroness, I kind of get that. I see Baroness as kind of a, one of those bands that's definitely mixing the old and the new. They mostly sound fairly retro to me. Very 70-esque, but of course they have newer progressive things that separate them a little bit from that. But there you go. Down, I'm a little surprised to see on here because I don't see them as being incredibly modern. They started out in the 90s, so I would consider them more of an older group. But I do think Down is important because if it wasn't for Down, we wouldn't have bands like, like Baroness or Mastodon, I don't think, popping up. So I think they definitely did have a big impact. Dream Theater, again, I consider them more, they were coming up in the 90s. So, again, modern here is a relative term. Ghost, again, very retro sounding. So I don't know what to say about them. But yes, I would consider them modern since they started in this century. Lamb of God, I would consider. I know Lamb of God started in the 90s, I believe, but it was either 90s or early 2000s. Sorry, I'm not a giant Lamb of God fan. But I think they're fine. Again, I can take them or leave them, but their sound makes them a bit more modern, I guess. Mastodon, I already talked about. I do enjoy Mastodon, and I definitely consider them fairly modern. Lots of different elements to their music. Monster Magnet, I don't even consider metal. They're hard rock, but whatever. Opeth, again, same thing, they started out as death metal, and now they're just really proggy rock. The Sword, very retro sounding. And Tool, again, not what I would call a newer band, but whatever. So, again, on this list specifically, we've got, even on this list, which are supposed to be, quote, modern metal bands, we have some bands that are, frankly, in my opinion, shouldn't be on this list, not because I don't think they're good, but because I don't think they're, quote, modern enough, as in they started in the 90s, and I don't think any band that started in the 90s should really be considered modern metal, regardless of their influence on the scene. That's just my opinion, and I'm going to show you another article here. It's going to kind of bear this out. We got the 50 most important metal bands in the 21st century. I'm not going to go over all 50 bands. We're just going to scroll through real quick, and we're going to see basically a list of bands that maybe should and shouldn't be on this list. Like some of these bands started in this century, but a decent amount of them started in the 90s that we see on this list. Not that I don't, again, as far as your opinion on any of these bands individually, that's not really what we're talking about. It's just more, how old are they? Should they be on this list? That's really all it is. The funniest thing about I don't feel the need to keep going through this list. The funniest thing, okay, here it is. Iron Maiden's on this list. As much as I love Iron Maiden, and they are absolutely one of my favorite bands, I don't necessarily think they deserve to be on this list. We may as well put Ozzy on this list, right? The reason I say that is because they started so long ago. I wouldn't consider them a band of the 20... Yes, they're still currently active, but come on. Judas Priest is also on this list. So which is funny to me. I mean, yeah, because there's Judas Priest. Again, clearly one of my favorite bands, and yes, they just put out a killer album in 2018, and I'm sure they're going to put out another killer album soon. But and yes, they have a giant impact on metal, but I don't know if I'd call them a band of the 21st century. So basically, this list, again, is a mixture of the old and the new, right? Old and new, old and new. And essentially, if we look at any of these lists, because this is the 50 most popular metal bands according to the internet, and same thing, old and new, and 150 bands listed by their Spotify monthly listener counts. Again, we're going to have a mixture of old and new, old and new, old and new. Are we noticing a trend here? I think we are. So basically, I'm just going to bottom line this. Let's expand me out a little bit. I'm growing up there. Okay, so basically, bottom line is, at least according to all these metrics of, quote, popularity I can find, it seems like there is a big old mix between old and new bands, right? Which is kind of what I would expect. I mean, metal is an old genre at this point. It's 50 years old, so it's not surprising that a lot of the old guard is, kicking around and still doing its thing. And it would make sense that there's a lot of newer bands because metal, unlike rock, is more of an underground phenomenon and can survive being in a smaller box, in fact, I think metal thrives on being in the smaller box, right? Because back when metal was bigger, I don't think it was quite as innovative. I think when it shrinks down a little bit, it almost seems like to be slightly more on edge, slightly more innovative, because there's always a dichotomy between the more commercial side and the more what I would call artistically pure side. And I've talked about this in the selling out video and all that, but there's always that pull between the two. And it seems that ever since metal's resurgence in the late 90s, and I feel that whole resurgence of metal started because of the popularity of the internet. I think that's wholly responsible for metal coming back the way that it did. Frankly, the creative side has been bigger since then. Now, one thing, when I was looking at these lists of the most popular metal bands, now, to be fair, there are a lot of clean singing vocalists out there, as in non-screamers, non-growlers, but there are very few standout vocalists nowadays in the top 50 most important metal bands of the 21st century, even though Priest and Maiden are somehow in the article. Overall, I think there is too much emphasis on screaming and growling in modern metal. Although I do like that style. I do like the screaming vocals. I do like death metal, so I'm not downing that type of metal. And I like some black metal. So I'm not downing that vocal style and saying it's quote unquote bad. I just think there's a bit too much emphasis on it. I just wish there were some Halfords or Dickinsons out there. There don't really seem to be. Yeah, you got guys in power metal that can handle a lot of those vocals, but you don't think of them in the same league as you do Bruce or Rob for whatever reason. Heck, I'd love to have some Chuck Billies or Bobby Blitzes out there, and nobody thinks that Bobby Blitz is the greatest vocalist ever, but goddamn, he is distinctive. Nobody sounds like Bobby Blitz. He is not, you hear Bobby, it's Bobby. One thing that I really liked about metal before is all of the vocalists, no matter what their level of technical skill, most of them were extremely distinctive from one another. You'd hear them, and you'd instantly say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so, that's so-and-so. Nowadays, a lot of it is the growling, and they're completely interchangeable. They all sound pretty much the same. They're not nearly as distinctive. The vocal distinctiveness that used to go hand in hand is pretty much done, right? So that is something that I do miss quite a bit. Let's see. Overall, I think metal is in a fairly good place right now. There are always new bands popping up and pushing boundaries. And yeah, it is definitely underground compared to a lot of other forms of music. But again, I think that's where it thrives the most. Now, one thing, of course, we have to talk about is a lot of these newer bands, again, just ape what came before, which I said earlier. So do you think that metal relies too much on its past And just basically, because of course with the rethrash movement and some other stuff, in Ghost and other bands, you definitely hear bands that just sound retro, like they're not really bringing a whole lot of super new stuff to the table. And that's a fair assessment to make, right? So do you feel that there's too much of that and not enough innovation? Or do you think there's too much change and things need to go back to the way they were? Um, as for me, I think it's a mixed bag. A lot of bands I think do just sound like older bands, and I kind of wish there was more diversity as far as that goes, and there were more newer sounds. But that being said, I think there are a lot of newer sounds in a lot of these bands. Like I said, those progressive elements are spreading out, and there are starting to be new sounds created. But another question: has everything that can be done in metal already been done? Is there anywhere new for the new places for the genre to go? Or is it time just to say, okay, we've done everything in metal that we could possibly do, and all we can keep doing is kind of rehashing what's already been done? I'm of a few minds of this. In some ways, I say yes. In some ways, I say no. I'm not a musician. I don't know. I'm also not a young person. I'd really be especially interested to hear from people, I don't know, 25 and under in the comments below. Let me know what you think of the current state of metal. I, of course, want to hear from people in my own age group as well. I want to hear from everyone what you think the current state of metal is. I think it, again, overall, fairly good. Maybe could be a bit better. I wouldn't mind seeing some things done differently. Maybe a few different directions. I don't know. One thing I know I don't want to see in metal is what's happening to a lot of, quote, rock and roll nowadays. I hope I never see this in metal, as in guitars not being prominently featured, because Imagine Dragons and 21 Pilots are considered rock. If that ever happens in metal, I don't know what I'll do. I would probably just only listen to old music at that point. So I don't know. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think. I know I was all over the place with this. If you agree, disagree, whatever, let me know. That is it. Thank you so much for watching. As always, live long and prosper. Keep on rocking.